I met her in 2016, I'm sure, when she first started birding. And so she is going to present tonight on her trip to the Canadian Arctic and the territory of Nunavut and Baffin Island. And it was a camping trip, and she saw a lot of different wildlife. So I'll give you Maria's story.
Thank you. All right. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to try to collapse down the Zoom a little bit. There we go. Okay. So, yeah, this is my talk on the wildlife travels in the Canadian Arctic. As I was reviewing this presentation, I remembered it was about a year ago in November of 2023 that I told you all about my Antarctica trip. So I have not been to either pole, but I have been to very north and very south. So thank you for inviting me tonight, and I hope you enjoy the presentation, and feel free to interrupt with questions at any time. So this trip was called Narwhals and Polar Bears, and the town is Pond Inlet. It was in June of 2023, and this was a tent camping trip at the ice floe edge through a company called Eagle Eye Tours, and I've provided the link there. There's a couple of different outfitters that run a trip like this. And I ended up going with Eagle Eye, mostly because it was the first one that I stumbled on, but also because it was about $5,000 cheaper than the similar trips. The luxury level was also quite a bit less on my trip compared to the other trips. So maybe some people would say you should have paid more money, but I don't know. It's camping. It's not supposed to be that fancy. So, but that's the trip. So why Nunavut? I really don't know. I had been interested in the Canadian Arctic or the Arctic in general for a while. I'm not really sure how I first heard about this territory in Canada, but somehow I did. And I just had really had an itch to go to the Canadian Arctic. I tried to convince my sister to come on this trip with me. She thought I was completely crazy and said, absolutely no way, never, ever. As I started investigating Arctic travel options, I realized there's a lot of different options. There's trips in Canada, trips in Greenland, trips to Svalbard and Scandinavia. But the Canadian Arctic seemed relatively straightforward, at least for us folks from North America, because you just go straight up. Of course, the other places are more European based and would just take more time to get there. And then there was lots of trip options. So there was kind of these tundra trips where you spend the majority of your time on land looking for tundra birds and wildlife. There's boat cruises, which could be small cruises or large cruises. There's these land tours where they drive you around. And then there's the ice floe edge. And again, when I had just Googled like Nunavut Arctic trips, I ran into this Eagle Eye trip, and it was camping on the ice floe edge. And I'll explain what that means in a moment. And so for some reason that seemed pretty intriguing to me. And I kind of just, I never looked for other trip options, but I didn't find anything that was, I guess, that I wanted to do more. So I ended up taking this trip. But just so you know, there's lots of different options if anyone is interested in a different type of trip. So where is this place? So here's a map of Canada, and we mostly think about Canada being kind of down here, right? Everyone's heard of the Canadian Rocky Mountains and Vancouver and Ottawa and Quebec and all of that, but actually half of Canada is up here, and not too many people live there. So specifically the territory of Nunavut is this portion, and then also this portion, and I've got that on the next map here. So Nunavut was named a different name, and I'm not remembering at the moment, but about 20 or 30 years ago. And then the Canadian government had conversations with the Inuit peoples who are native peoples to that territory. And eventually through those conversations, they decided to rename Nunavut to Nunavut. And like I said, I'm sorry, I don't remember the old name. But it's a very large territory. A big portion of it is in the Arctic Circle, as you can see here from from this red dashed line. Baffin Island is here, and this is one of the largest islands in the world. I believe it's the 5th largest island in the world. And specifically where I was in this little kind of town / community called Pond Inlet, okay? There's a little bit of interesting history about Pond Inlet. So as I mentioned before, the Inuit people live up here, and they have different kind of communities or settlements. Well, at the beginning of the Cold War, the Canadian government decided that they needed some more folks living up here, basically to protect against Russia from moving across the Arctic ice and then establishing bases. So they relocated some folks from an Inuit community and kind of plopped them down. Oops, let me get my little mouse here. Pointer options. I'm going to use my little laser pointer. They basically plopped them down here at this spot because it was a very northern spot. And they said, okay, guys, you guys live here. And that way the Russians kind of can't come across and take this land. Ellesmere Island is the most northern island in the world. And there is a small Air Force base up here on Ellesmere Island, but no sort of permanent or natural residents of Ellesmere Island. So how do you get there? I flew from Chicago to Ottawa. I'm going to go back on the map here. So Ottawa is a bit more east of Toronto. Then we flew from Ottawa to the town of Iqaluit, which is the capital of the territory of Nunavut. And that's actually a fairly large town by rural Canadian standards. I don't remember how many people live there, maybe 10,000. Not a lot, but they had a hospital and kind of their main government center was there. Then we flew from Iqaluit all the way across Baffin Island to the town of Pond Inlet. We stayed in the hotel in Pond Inlet, which I believe I have some pictures of. We then moved via komatiks, which are sleds and snowmobiles, out to the ice floe edge. We camped on the ice for 5 nights and then came back using the snowmobiles and the komatiks to Pond Inlet and kind of made our way back down to Ottawa. So specifically zooming in on that area of Pond Inlet, this is Pond Inlet. This is the town or the community as they call it. This part here is called Bylot Sound. And then there's another island here called Bylot Island. And this island is designated as a national park. It's called Semirillik National Park. And in order to do anything in these regions, you need to have a permit, which our guides did have. So the ice, this is the ocean, the Arctic Ocean, and in the wintertime, it freezes over and comes down. And that changes year to year depending on how cold it is. And so in the springtime, the ocean starts melting and there's basically an edge of the ice, and that's called the ice floe edge. And as this ice melts, there's a lot of plankton and other small critters that are released basically by the melting of the ice. And so it's a very nutritionally active part of the ocean and it attracts a lot of animals. So that's why specifically this tour was at the ice floe edge, because there's a lot of wildlife that basically hangs close to that edge for several months, because as the seasons progress, the ice gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So we actually did our camping somewhere right about in here. So yeah. So a couple of pictures of the airport. This is the Iqaluit Airport. The airline was called Canadian North, which when I've talked to even Canadians, they've never heard of this airline. It's a small airline. It mainly is in Nunavut and a little bit in the Western Territories. But as you can see here, here's our airplane. It's a jet turbo type thingy. And then here was our tracking board in the airport. So this language is the language of the Inuit people. It's called Inuktitut. And so it would cycle between English, an English version of Inuktitut, which was just, letters, like English letters, but in the phrasing of Inuktitut, and then their, I guess you would call it pictographic language. So I was just kind of a fun picture. I like that one. So we walked out to the airplane and popped on, and we flew over. This is Baffin Island, and you can see some very, very large glaciers here. This is obviously quite mountainous. Here's another glacier coming down. The vast majority of this Baffin Island is completely uninhabited. As you can tell, this is not really a nice place to live. Along the coast of Baffin Island is where all the Inuit communities are. And back in the day, they primarily traveled by either boat or dog sled. So the interior of the island is completely uninhabited. This is the Pond Inlet Airport, which is basically a glorified and large trailer type structure. So it's a metal building. There was a bathroom in there. The baggage compartment was basically, you would check in kind of at this end of the building. They would open up a big door. They would take your bags and they would directly load it onto a truck. And then your truck would just drive, a couple hundred feet over to the airplane, and then they would load your bags onto the airplane. You can see that it's a dirt runway. There's no air traffic control. They have like one flight a day, maybe 2 flights a day, depending on the schedule. We were told by people who travel to Pond Inlet frequently that Canadian North may schedule several flights. And if the flights are not very full, they'll cancel and consolidate. So even though you have a scheduled flight, you may end up on a different flight. This is a view of the town from the airport, and I didn't have a really good kind of looking down, but here are just some different town buildings. This bit right back here is the Bylot Sound, which is the ocean. And then back here, this range of mountains are the Bylot Island Mountains. And then here's just another picture looking across the sound. They had this little kind of park area, I guess you could say. There was a small gazebo with this marker at the park, and it says 72 degrees north. And yeah, I don't know. It was just a cool picture. It looks like it needs a little bit of TLC. The paint is peeling, but so one interesting thing about working, so we had let me step back a little bit. So Eagle Eye is a Canadian company, and they're based out of the British Columbia area. And so we had a Canadian bird guide. I guess I should say an English origin Canadian bird guide. Once we got up to Pond Inlet, we had a number of Inuit guides. And so they weren't specifically interested in birds. They just had the skills to survive in extreme environments like this. And so there was one gentleman, his name was Shayati, and he was the leader, and he's been doing these types of trips for decades. And then he had a couple of younger guys with him. And our bird guide, Steve, from the get-go, he was like, guys, you got to be kind of patient with these folks, because they don't really operate on a Western schedule. They sort of operate on like, oh, it's time to go now kind of schedule. So in the morning, once we got to Pond Inlet, we flew in the afternoon, spent the night, and then in the morning, they're like, okay, we'll leave for the ice floe edge sometime today. There was a couple of folks on the trip who were very used to strict itineraries. I had never really met professional traveler type folks before, but there were some people who had traveled to like 100 countries on this trip. And they're like, okay, so we're going to leave at like 9 o'clock, 9:30, 10 o'clock. And our guide was like, we're going to leave today. And these folks really struggled with this trip. And so, so in the morning, our guide, Steve, took us out on a bird walk, which probably was his way of just trying to kill time while the Inuit folks kind of got their stuff together. So, but I really enjoyed it, because the whole point of the trip for me was to be outdoors and see new things and explore the tundra. So we walked out. As you can see here, there's still quite a lot of ice. And it's kind of marshy, but it's looking pretty dead. But we saw Baird's sandpiper, black-bellied plover, Lapland longspur, and the snow bunting. I've seen snow bunting in Iowa before, but it was pretty fun to see them in their breeding colors because this guy is quite white, and same for the Lapland longspur. He is also quite colorful and beautiful. So we walked for a couple of hours in the morning, kind of a slow pace, looking at different birds. And we get back in the early afternoon, and then our bird guide, Steve, says he needs to go to the grocery store. And so we were like, okay. So we kind of wait at the hotel. I ended up trekking with them to go to the grocery store just to see, and a couple of the other guests came along as well. Unfortunately, the grocery store was filled with a whole bunch of processed junk food, which was sad to see, but we bought a few essentials for things that are helpful for camping. Eventually, kind of mid-afternoon, we came down to the quote beach. As you can see, the beach is completely frozen. This is all ice. And these structures here are these Comatic sleds. So back in the day, again, these used to be pulled by teams of dogs. There are some folks who still have dogs, but for the most part now they're pulled by snowmobiles. But there's these long sleds that are designed to travel over the ice with ease, relatively low center of gravity. And then this part is basically a bunch of plywood that's kind of roughly put together, painted white, and it's a windbreak for when we're traveling. So we hung out at the beach for a while, and the folks that were impatient in the morning were now even more impatient because they were not used to kind of dealing with loose agendas. One funny story is that my guide, Steve, when he was in the grocery store, they were looking for one more Inuit guide. And so Steve goes to this gentleman named Jeremiah. He's like, hey, Jeremiah, what are you doing the next couple of days? And Jeremiah goes, I don't know. And Steve's like, why don't you come out with us on this trip? And so Jeremiah goes, okay, sure, why not? And so he goes back to his home and gets himself packed up to come on a 5-day trip out to the ice floe camping. So as you can see, it was a little bit loosey-goosey. But well, yeah, I ended up falling asleep on the beach because, why not when you're just waiting around. So I didn't know they took that picture of me. But eventually we got going. And so we started traveling on the ice floe edge. You can see here's the snowmobile. This is a gas can that they use to obviously refill their snowmobiles. Here's the Comatic. They put several people in each Comatic, and we just drove and drove and drove. And so over here is the Bylot Island, the national park. Here is the mainland of Baffin Island. And it was about a 2.5 hour snowmobile ride out to the ice floe edge. We did take a couple of breaks just to get out and walk around and kind of move our legs and things like that. But for the most part, we just kept going. The break spots always seemed pretty random because everything looked completely the same to people who aren't acquainted to looking at these sorts of landmarks. Did I get cold? Not really. It was cold the whole time. It was about 35 degrees throughout the whole trip, day and night. It was in the middle of the Arctic summer. So I was well above the Arctic Circle. So the sun never set. So we had daylight 24 hours for the whole time that I was above the Arctic Circle. The sun, of course, dropped down a little bit lower on the horizon in the evenings and then came up higher during the day. I did get a little chilly by the end of that 2.5 hours just because you weren't moving around. It was more of a feet and hands thing, but I was well dressed otherwise. So we get to camp, and here's our camp. We still are about a mile from the ice floe edge, and the reason being is that the seawater is melting, right? And so out of an abundance of caution related to safety, they had us camping well back from the ice floe edge. Unfortunately, it does happen that when the Inuit folks spend time out on the ice floe edge, sometimes pieces of the ice do break off, and then that's a fairly involved rescue operation. So they didn't really want to be doing that with with tourists. So we stayed well back. There were 3 groups of, this trip was run 3 times. So it was run kind of late May to early June, mid-June, and then I was in the final group, the final trip. The reason it's run only 3 times the whole year is because that's the conditions of the ice. Too early in the season and the ice floe edge is too far out into the ocean, essentially. Too late in the season and it's getting dangerous. And I will show you some pictures at the end that in 5 days, the ice conditions actually changed quite a bit. So in terms of our camping, we were fairly close to, this is Bylot Island. We have a nice sturdy piece of plywood here on the ground. There actually is some water underneath that plywood because related to heat of bodies in the tent and things, it's starting to melt. And as you can see, the tents are actually depressed down a little bit into the ice. Inside the tent, there was a fairly thick 4-inch cold mattress or like cold weather mattress type thing, which was fairly comfy. And then there was also like a 20-degree rated, very thick cozy sleeping bag. This is the part where I lost my sister. Like the camping was number 1, but then the cold was number 2. But I do have to say I was not cold when I was in the tent, and I definitely wasn't cold when I was out and about. But being well dressed made all the difference. For the most part, it wasn't very windy. I think if we'd had a lot of wind, that would have been a different story. So each person had their own tent, and we brought all of our stuff into our tent and unpacked, and there we were for 5 days. There was also a heated dining tent, and surprisingly, we got warm, and so we ended up turning the heat off from time to time. They had a kitchen tent, and then they had a lovely toilet tent. Most of the men didn't seem to need the toilet tent, so it was the few ladies on the trip that spent the most time in there. So, all right. So after we got settled into camp the next morning, we went out to the ice floe edge and we had these lovely chairs set up and we just basically sat and watched. As with a lot of wildlife trips, this wasn't the type of trip where you just drive around constantly, basically sat and watched. And so we were probably at the ice floe edge for about 7 to 8 hours. We were really lucky on our first day that we saw a small pod of bowhead whales coming by. And so, I mean, obviously you can't take great pictures of whales, but here's a picture of the whales. And so these whales will just swim up and down the ice floe edge. They're baleen whales. So they are filtering ocean water and particles and plankton and all those things through their baleen, and they're eating. And then because there's a lot of activity with the water getting stirred up, there's often a lot of bird life as well. So we watched the whales. I had made some notes in my journal that it was just really, really amazing hearing these whales breathe because as they were going by, you can hear the air coming in and out of their blowholes, which was awesome. They were, moving slowly and didn't really seem to know that we were there, or if they did know, they didn't care. We weren't super close to them, but it was really remarkable. I will say one thing about the cruise options. Cruising is a pretty cool thing to do, but you'd never be able to get this close to a whale in a boat. So being on the ice floe edge gave you a really unique perspective on being close to the animals. Some other birds that we saw were red-throated loon. We had common eaters and the thick-billed mirror. We had king eaters and then long-tailed ducks. So let's see here. These guys should be the common eaters, I believe. This is the king eater, yes. And then here are our long-tailed ducks. And this is essentially the beginning of the Arctic bird breeding season. So a lot of these birds are coming up this far into the Arctic at least, because things have really just started thawing out. So the birds are just finding a place to nest. And so we were seeing the arrivals of the wildlife essentially. Here's another picture of the thick-billed mirrors. And then these ones were funny because there was a little piece of the ice here just floating along, and these birds were just pretty content to sit on there and just kind of keep floating along. There's also ringed seals. We could have seen a harp seal. That would have also been an option, a possible animal, but we didn't see any of those. But the ringed seals are pretty common. And the ringed seals are very curious. And so when they were swimming by and they would see us on the ice floe edge, they would do this like spy hopping thing where they kind of like come in and out of the water, trying to like look around and figure out what's going on. There's also holes in the ice. So farther back from the ice floe edge, the seals will essentially chew a hole in the ice, and that's their breathing hole. So they'll kind of come up and pop their head out and take their breaths and then come back down. And the seals will keep those holes open through the winter so that way they can breathe. This was a baby seal. This is one of my favorite pictures of the trip just because of the colors. And so this gentleman's using the spotting scope and people are just kind of sitting and, looking out over the ocean. We're facing east at this point. So if we could have looked far enough, we would have been able to see Greenland. And here's just another picture of the ice floe edge. We were allowed to get fairly close to the ice floe edge, maybe approximately 10 feet away from the edge. There was a few people who were a bit brave and got closer, but I wasn't one of them. I didn't think a swim would be a good idea. These were some of my favorite pictures as well because just these ice fragments were absolutely beautiful. It was really, really still. You can see the beautiful colors in the sky, the grays, and I just really, really liked that. It was so peaceful. It wasn't windy at all. And these bits of ice were just floating around with the current. These were some really big icebergs. And so this is actually an iceberg, which is a break off from a glacier. And this came all the way from Greenland as the icebergs kind of float, and then they get frozen into the frozen ocean. And then as the ocean unfreezes in the summertime, the icebergs continue floating on and eventually melt again. I will actually make a note is that all of our water from the trip was from these icebergs. So our guides found a chunk of ice and I don't have a picture of it in this presentation, unfortunately, but they basically chopped up big pieces of ice. And then that was what we used for our drinking water the whole time. We didn't drink the water from the ice floe edge because that's seawater or salt water. So that wasn't healthy or tasty. So some seabirds that we saw, we had black-legged kittiwake, northern fulmar, parasitic jaeger, and long-tailed jaeger. I liked that guy. We did have a couple very, very, very serious birders on the trip, including a guy named Lou, who was desperate to find an ivory gull. He thinks he found one. I am not that level of birder, although maybe some people would say otherwise, but I didn't count an ivory gull on my list, but he looked for it. He was so diligent. He was always looking for it. The trip was about narwhals too. And so on our third day of ice floe sitting, we did get to see some narwhals, and that's what this guy is right here. We did not see any narwhals with tusks. We did see a mom and a baby narwhal, which is here, but again, you can't really tell. It just looks like a lump in the water. So, and then we were fortunate enough to have another group of bowhead whales coming by on day 4, which was really, really special because it's not obviously all the time you get to see an animal like that. So as with all wildlife trips, it takes a lot of patience. Again, we weren't going around from location to location for the most part. Sometimes we'd pick a spot more north on the ice floe, sometimes a little bit more south. But for the most part, we were just sitting at one location watching and seeing kind of what wildlife came by. So there was a lot of time where it was just very peaceful and very quiet. And we were looking at birds. And Lou was always looking for the ivory gull. So every gull that came by, he was looking. But there was a lot of time when we weren't seeing animals. So just a few notes around camp. Lou actually found this white morph gyrfalcon with a nest. So that was a really awesome find for me. And I probably will never see one of those again in my life. It stood out pretty well against the cliffs there. This was Anna. She was one of our Inuit guides. She came along as an assistant cook. Our guide, Steve, got a bit frustrated with her because one time she was trying to boil a pot of water, and the pot of water was not shielded from the wind at all. So he was like, you got to shield this from the wind, because they were trying to make soup for us, and it was not warming up. So her cooking skills may have required a little bit improvement, but she did okay. And then here is our lovely toilet. And so basically there was a 5-gallon bucket with a plastic bag, and then they put this majestic throne over that bucket, and voila, and a little tent. Just a quick note on the inside of the Comatix. As you can tell, this is an absolute luxury vehicle. We ended up sort of sitting on various pieces of suitcases and things as we traveled back and forth each day. So here's on our day 5. So we're packing up and headed back to Pond Inlet. I would just like to point out, especially down here, that this has all turned to water. And 5 days ago, when we went out there, it was snow from my first pictures. And so we've had quite a bit of melting in 5 days. And I think everyone was feeling pretty good about heading back to land at that point. I should say that the ice thickness was about 3 feet thick. So it was very, very thick. And I originally was kind of nervous or worried about, oh, how is this going to be walking on the ice? And am I going to hear cracks or anything like that? But it was very, very thick, and you didn't know you were walking on ice just from the texture. It was very solid. This was a funny picture because this was a grandma lady who came out to assist with the cooking. And so on the way home, they basically plopped her into the baggage Comatec and just let her sit there. And she doesn't even have a windbreak. So she had her hood pulled up, and we were like, I don't know, is this so good? Is this how you want to transport grandma? But she seemed pretty used to it, and she didn't mind very much. And so yeah, it was just a funny picture. So yeah, the ice is melting. You can see here that there's a lot of melt ponds on the ice, and now we've got some spray coming up from the snowmobiles, and we had to go through these fairly wide cracks. This crack was actually about 3 feet wide, and you can see right in here that the ice is fairly thick. So how did they get around that? Basically, once we got to this crack, the snowmobile stopped and the Comatix stopped. The snowmobiles detached themselves from the Comatix, and they started driving along the crack until they found a spot where it wasn't as thick, or where it wasn't as wide anymore, where they could safely get across. So then the snowmobiles went down, I don't know, maybe a quarter of a mile or so. They crossed over the crack because it was much smaller there, and then they kind of came back around, reattached the ropes to the Comatec, and then pulled the Comatec across the crack. The Comatec itself was fairly large, like maybe 15 or 18 feet. So the Comatec safely could cross over this, but not the snowmobile. And there were no cracks like that when we had gone out 5 days before. So back in Pond Inlet, we had the opportunity to do another tundra hike. Things were still looking relatively brown, but we'd had quite a bit more ice and snow melt since we had been gone. And so some of the tundra was starting to come to life. This is called an Arctic willow. I suppose you could call it a woody plant. I'm not the best with plants, but it is a willow. And this is the little willow bud there. There's quite a few different flowers, some purple, some yellow. There's, of course, lots of mosses and lichens. And probably one of my other favorite finds from the trip was this Arctic bumblebee. I had no idea that there were bumblebees in the Arctic. So when someone spotted that, I immediately wanted a picture, and I was like, wow, that is super cool that bumblebees are adapted to this environment. And so I really enjoyed those hikes, and it was just kind of a slow pace, just looking around, listening, looking for birds. Yeah, it was awesome. And a couple more birds. We've got our long-tailed duck. This is a male, and this red-throated loon pair, and then the white-rumped sandpiper. And I would like to say that I did not take that photo. That one was from our guide, Steve. And this was on a hike near Pond Inlet. We had some time in Pond Inlet on our last day before our flight departed, going back down to Iqaluit. So I walked around the town for about probably 2 to 3 hours. Excuse me, this white building here is the kind of library and community center and museum. They had a small museum, probably about the size of this room, just talking about the history of Pond Inlet and the people there. And then, like I said, a library and kind of community center. So it was a really nice building. And then this was in outside of the grocery store. So again, lots of kind of metal buildings. And there was a Tim Hortons shop in that grocery store, which, if you don't know, is a fairly popular coffee chain in Canada. So one of the gentlemen from New Zealand was fairly excited about this Tim Hortons specifically. I was just happy to get a hot cup of coffee. And yeah, I had my picture taken there. And then here is administration for the Canadian National Parks, the Similarlik National Park. This was mainly like a functional building. They didn't really have a visitor center or anything like that. There was just a small reception area where you could buy like a t-shirt and a magnet, and there was a few books, but mainly it was a functional building. Trying to think, this was the people that I saw in that office were English Canadians, not Inuit Canadians. Now, it's possible that they did employ Inuit Canadians, but the parks officers were English Canadians. Okay, I'm just going to take a moment and kind of pause before I go on to the part about Iqaluit, and let me get some water. So I should make a note about the Inuit folks and hunting. For thousands or hundreds of years, these folks have relied on hunting the animals that live in the region for their nutrition. And they still do a lot of hunting, despite the fact that their grocery store is filled with junk food. They had wonderful things to say about seal meat, narwhals, and polar bears. And so they, as part of kind of agreements with the Canadian government, they are allowed to hunt a certain number of animals as part of their kind of quotas, they would call it. And so there is a wildlife officer. And so if the natives killed an animal, they would have to radio that into the wildlife officer. And then each community keeps account of the number of animals that they kill. And then they're allowed to have a certain number of animals each year based on the size of the community. And from what I was understanding, this does seem to be a very collaborative process between the Inuit communities and the Canadian government, in that the Inuit communities understand the importance of kind of managing the populations, and the Canadian government understands the importance of the traditions and the nutrition that these animals do provide. The Inuit guides that we worked with, I think, were somewhat embarrassed about all of this, because they understand that we had spent thousands of dollars to get to that location, to see the animals, to appreciate the animals, and then, you know, that they are essentially killing and eating them. So they didn't talk about it a whole lot. And our guide, Steve, said, you know, they're kind of embarrassed about it. So don't make like a big deal out of it, and asked us to be respectful of their traditions and their practices. And it didn't personally bother me. There was one lady on the trip that it was really, really disturbing to her, but I understood that was part of their community. So it did seem like they did a good job monitoring the kills that they had for the animals. So I will also say that they seemed very responsible in using all parts of the animals. They had boots and gloves made out of the skins of the animals, and these animals are adapted to very cold climates. And so their pelts are very, very warm. And these items are used for years. So I just have to bring that up because that was the reality of the trip and of this community where people lived. So we flew back from Pond Inlet down through Baffin Island down to Iqaluit. I thought this picture was pretty funny because the dog was barking at the stuffed dog. And this is a church in Iqaluit. I don't really know. I don't know that the Inuit people have a religion per se. I know that they do a lot with kind of their own native traditions, just like the Native Americans here. But there was this church. I didn't go inside it. But I'm sure that Christian missionaries tried to convert people here, just like they have everywhere else in the world. So that's all I have to say about that. There was quite a few of these little rock statues around Iqaluit and also in Pond Inlet, and this seemed to be a symbol of Nunavut and of the native peoples, of the Inuit people. I think it's mostly a symbol of kind of welcoming and like of community. And so there would be these little rock structures around. This one's actually fairly large. It was probably like 8 feet tall. And then you probably can't see this photo very well, but my watch says that it's 11:30 at night, and we were slightly south of the Arctic Circle here, so the sun had actually set, but it never got much darker than about this, which was pretty amazing. Iqaluit had 1 or 2 paved roads. So the main road through Iqaluit was paved, and that was the road that went by the airport. But otherwise, for the most part, it was these kind of dirt roads. So overall thoughts on the trip, I would give it 4 stars. It was just an incredible location. You know, not very many people get to a spot like this. I was incredibly fortunate that I was able to go on this trip. It was really unique with the ice floe camping. We basically had an unlimited amount of time for wildlife observing because we were camping. We could see wildlife from our campsites. We had all the time at the ice floe edge. So that was really awesome because, you know, you go all that way, you want to actually spend time outside looking for wildlife. The Inuit guides were very friendly. They were all lovely, kind, welcoming people. There was some drama and disorganization. I didn't tell you about other things, but there was some arguments between people, and one person left in the middle of the night, and then they had to try to find another cook. And so that's where Grandma came in, and she kind of came out to help. And unfortunately, just like a lot of communities, there was people there who struggled with alcohol issues, not specifically on our trip, but they acknowledged that that's a big problem in the communities, and there's kind of not a good solution for it. Again, we didn't really operate on a Western timeline. We operated on the Inuit timeline. I'm a pretty flexible person. I knew that at the end of the day, I was going to get back home to Iowa. So whether we left at 10, 11, or 12, it didn't matter too much to me. But if you're the type of person who needs an itinerary, this may not have been the trip for you. This was cheaper than the competitors. It was about $11,000. So it's definitely an expensive trip. But there was a trip that was about $5,000 more than this, and they actually had a shower tent. Now, how they got hot water, I have no idea. I guess I believe they brought like propane tanks and things like that and had hot water. But I guess I was okay to not take a shower for 5 days. Trying to get undressed when it's 35 degrees just didn't really seem that appealing to me. So we had a good bird guide. And like I say down here, this was not luxury, and even glamping was a stretch. It was super cool. I'm very glad I did it. I would probably do a similar trip again, but it's definitely not for the faint of heart. And I was told by some work colleagues to make sure I got a picture of me at the beach on this trip. They were making fun of me because I was going to a cold spot. So here's my picture on the beach. Thank you. Thank you for listening. Any questions? So it was a group of, so the question was, who else was on the trip? It was a group of 10 people total. We had one guy from New Zealand, one guy from Peru, about 5 Americans total. Who else was there? Maybe one European. It was an interesting group of people because, like I said, there was a couple who was professional travelers. Like they'd been everywhere. They'd been to 100 countries. They said they'd been to Iran. They'd done all of these like history tours, and they had done some wildlife stuff. They'd done the African safaris. And how they got interested in this particular trip, I have no idea, because the lady on the trip just was definitely not happy about not having a shower. She was like, I need to wash my hair. My hat's messing up my hair. Like, I can't change my clothes and all of these things. It was kind of like, well, you signed up for a camping trip. Like, should have known that going into it. The other guys just seemed like wildlife enthusiasts. Some of them were more serious, some of them were less serious. The gentleman that I mentioned, Lou, he was really looking specifically for like ivory gull and probably a few other birds. So yeah, it was just a really interesting group of people. Yes, Linda. Oh yeah, I forgot to say about that. Okay, so the question was about polar bears. We did see one polar bear approximately 2 miles away. Oh, the guy from Taiwan. We know it was 2 miles away because he sent his drone after it. I mean, well up, so it wasn't bothering it. And he started losing signal close to the 2-mile mark. How did we see it in the first place? Spotting scopes. So we had a couple spotting scopes, and we were frequently scanning for polar bears. And so we saw this polar bear kind of running through the ice. And so I did get a far, far away view of it would have been nice to see it a little bit closer, but such it goes with wildlife trips. So yeah, we looked and looked and just couldn't find any. The Inuit guides were fairly nervous about the polar bears for obvious reasons. We were in an area once where there was a lot of rough ice. And so it was very kind of bumpy, and they were fairly cautious in that area because they said the polar bears like to kind of nestle down and sleep in these little, ice kind of, I don't know, caves or whatever you want to call them. Not really a cave, but just that they can get snuggled in. And so they were cautious in that area because they said you can be driving along on your snowmobile and pretty much come upon a polar bear and not see it because they blend in. So, but we didn't see a polar bear there. Yes. So precautions with camping with polar bears. We should have maybe taken more precautions. Again, this was like the, B or C level trip. Apparently on the more expensive trip, they would have guides that would sit up 24 hours a day and like watch for polar bears. We did not have a polar bear watch. The guides did have guns, but we never had to use them. Maybe there was more safety that went into that I wasn't aware of, but they didn't explain anything to us. But you'd think with like food and whatnot, the polar bears would be interested in the food. I guess though, polar bears probably like seals more than people food, but I don't know, they're scavengers, right? So yeah, looking back, it would have been a good idea to be a bit smarter about that. But in terms of the guns, apparently guns in Canada are pretty highly regulated, which I think many people know. So all of the guides had to have a permit to carry their gun, and they kept them like locked up in cases the whole time. So we felt pretty safe about that. They were usually, stuck on the back of the snowmobiles, and it wasn't like they were walking around with them. So yeah. Yes.
You said that broken off ice floes would flow how fast.
So how fast are they moving? So the question is kind of about how fast was the ice moving? That's a good question. I'd say probably a couple miles an hour. So not really fast, but fast enough that if you were unfortunate enough to be on a broken piece, you could find yourself in trouble pretty quickly. I'm going to go back to this picture for a moment. Oop. Well, I'll just show it here. So we were camping on this side of the ice floe edge, but there was also an edge over here on this side. Oh, you can't see it. Okay, thank you. Oh, let's see. There we go. Okay, and pointer. Laser pointer. Okay. We were camping over here on this edge, which is the eastern edge of the ice floe. There was another ice floe edge over here. And because of the melting and because of how much wildlife activity was going on at this time of year, this was actually like peak hunting season for the Inuit people. So when we were departing Pond Inlet in the airport, I heard people talking quietly. Apparently a chunk of the ice did fall off over here with the hunters on it, and it involved a helicopter rescue while we were there. They didn't tell us about that while it was happening. I'm sure the Inuit guides knew what was going on because they all had, radios and things, but they didn't tell us about it, which was probably a good idea because I imagine people might have gotten kind of nervous about that. But it seemed like it happened maybe once a season where somebody would get stuck out on the ice and then a rescue would be involved. I guess I don't know if it was a helicopter or a boat, but either way, they had to be rescued. So, yeah. Yes.
Talk about how much the ice is melting and climate change and.
So they so the question is, was there any conversations about the ice melting and climate change? I do know that it was changing. They didn't talk, specifically about that, but I'm sure the Canadian government monitors that because there's this whole website you can go to that shows the ice at any given time of the year with satellite images. Like we could pull it up right now if we wanted to. So, yeah, I don't, that probably, it's not a very good answer to your question, but it's interesting because theoretically they may not get any ice in the winter at some point, right? And then that's going to be really disruptive to their way of life because if there's no ice, there's no seals. If there's no seals, there's no food or, not very much food, not what they're used to. So, yeah. I didn't. They didn't offer it to us. Oh, so the question was, let's see, let me go back to my screen sharing here. I guess it paused on me. The question was, did I eat any seal? I didn't. It was not offered. I'm pretty adventurous. So if someone had offered it, I would have tried a bite. Yes, Jerry.
Maria, you showed a photograph of the, I think there were items, small flock. Did that happen during the day fairly often, that small flock, if you see movement of those birds like items and small stuff?
Yeah. So the question is about the photos that I showed of the eiders flying by and asking kind of when was that happening? So that was happening fairly frequently throughout the day on the ice floe edge. I can't say every 5 minutes there was a flock flowing by, but probably several times an hour, either the murres, the eiders, or the long-tailed ducks flying by. And who knows, maybe it was the same birds flying back and forth, but it was happening fairly often.
You see where they nest?
On Bylot Island. Yeah. The eiders are nesting on Bylot Island for our Zoom folks. Yeah, I guess I should say too, as maybe one final comment is one of the reasons I decided to take that trip when I did take that trip is because I didn't know if there would be another little person in our family one of these days. And we did have a little person join our family this past year. His name is Joel, and you can see him right there. So I don't think I'll be taking any adventure trips anytime soon until maybe he's a little older and he can join us. So.
What a cute little Joel.
Thank you, Maria.
Thank
Thank you
Maria.
very much.